Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're doing something a little different. Usually we talk about what life needs to survive, water, sunlight, air, but today we're turning off the air. We're cutting the oxygen supply completely.
It's a dramatic way to start, but you're absolutely right. We are venturing into the world of the anaerobes.
The monsters in the dark. And to guide us through this, this shadow world, we are cracking open Chapter 14 of Lippincott Illustrated Reviews, Microbiology.
Yeah.
Our mission today is pretty specific. We need to master the Clostridia, those are the gram-positive spore formers, and then we're going to tackle the gram-negative rods, specifically Bacteroids.
And this isn't just some, academic exercise. This chapter covers some of the most violent and rapid pathologies in medicine. We're talking gas gangrene, tetanus, botulism, and the hospital nightmare known as C. diff.
What strikes me immediately is the central irony here. These bacteria cause such devastating damage, yet they're incredibly fragile. Oxygen, the very thing that keeps us alive, is toxic to them. It kills them.
That is their defining characteristic. They are obligate anaerobes. They are, obligated to avoid oxygen.
But why, biologically, why does fresh air act like poison to a Clostridium cell?
It all comes down to how cells handle stress at a molecular level.
Yeah.
If you look at figure 14.2 in the source material, it maps this out beautifully.
Okay.
When any cell metabolizes oxygen, it's not a perfectly clean process. It creates waste products.
We're talking about free radicals, right?
Exactly. Superoxide radicals and hydrogen peroxide. Think of these as cellular shrapnel. They are highly reactive. They just bounce around inside the cell, shredding DNA, oxidizing proteins, breaking down lipids.
So aerobic bacteria, the ones that like oxygen, they must have some kind of shield.
They have a bomb squad. They produce specific enzymes, superoxide dismutase, catalase, and peroxidases. These enzymes basically patrol the cell and neutralize those radicals instantly, turning them into harmless water and oxygen.
And let me guess, our anaerobic friends fired the bomb squad.
They never hired them in the first place. Clostridia generally lack superoxide dismutase and catalase. So when they're exposed to oxygen, they just have no defense.
Yeah.
The radicals pile up, the DNA gets shredded, and the cell dies.
That physiology has to have a massive impact on how you handle these in a hospital. If I have a patient with a deep wound and I just swab it and leave it on the counter.
You've just ruined the diagnosis. That is a huge clinical aha moment. You cannot transport these samples in standard tubes. The oxygen in the room air will sterilize the sample before it ever even reaches the lab.
Wow.
You need special anaerobic transport media tubes that are oxygen-free, often containing reducing agents like cysteine or thioglycolate to absorb any stray oxygen.
So if you mess up the transport, the lab report comes back negative, but the patient is still full of lethal bacteria.
Precisely. It's a case where the biology directly dictates the clinical procedure.
All right, let's meet the lineup. We've got 4 main species of Clostridium to get through. Let's start with the brute force attacker, Clostridium perfringens.
This is the agent of gas gangrene. Morphologically, it's distinct. Lippincott describes it as a large, rectangular, boxcar-shaped rod.
Boxcar shape, so it's big and blocky.
It is. It's non-modal, but it grows with terrifying speed doubling every 8 to 10 minutes in the right conditions. It's in the soil, sewage, and frequently in our own GI tract. But the reason we fear it isn't its shape. It's the chemical warfare it wages.
The source lists a whole Greek alphabet of toxins here, alpha, theta, kappa. But the alpha-toxin seems to be the one we really need to understand.
Absolutely. If you remember one thing about C. perfringens, make it the alpha-toxin. It is a lecithinase.
Okay, let's unpack that. Lecithinase, so it breaks down lecithin.
Correct. And lecithin, or phosphatidylcholine, is a critical component of our cell membranes. It's the structural glue. This toxin literally dissolves the membranes of endothelial cells, red blood cells, white blood cells, everything.
So it's not just poisoning the cell, it's popping it like a water balloon.
Exactly. And it doesn't work alone. The bacteria also secrete collagenase and hyaluronidase,
which break down connective tissue.
Right, so imagine the scenario. A patient has a severe crush injury, maybe a motorcycle accident, where dirt-containing spores is forced deep into muscle tissue. The tissue is crushed, so the blood supply is cut off. No blood means
no oxygen. The perfect resort for an anaerobe.
The spores germinate. They start pumping out alpha-toxin, collagenase, hyaluronidase. They just melt the tissue ahead of them, liquefying muscle and spreading rapidly. This is myonecrosis.
And this is where the gas gangrene comes from.
Yes. As they ferment the carbohydrates in that dying tissue, they produce gas as a byproduct, and this gas gets trapped in the tissue planes,
leading to that very specific physical exam finding mentioned in the text, crepitation.
It's a visceral sign. If you press on the skin over the infection, it feels like bubble wrap popping underneath. You can feel and sometimes hear the crackling.
That is horrifying. And the prognosis?
Without treatment, it's fatal within days. The patient goes into shock from the massive toxin load. You have to be aggressive. Debridement is mandatory. You have to surgically cut out the dead tissue because antibiotics can't travel to tissue with no blood flow.
The text also mentions hyperbaric oxygen chambers. That connects right back to our intro, doesn't it?
It does. You put the patient in a high-pressure chamber with 100% oxygen. It forces oxygen into the tissues, which halts toxin production and kills the bacteria. You're literally using their weakness against them.
Now, perfringens has a sort of double life. It's not always a killer in a wound. Sometimes it's just ruining lunch.
Yes. Food poisoning. It's actually the third most common cause of food poisoning in the U.S.
And the mechanism is different here. It's associated with meat dishes kept warm.
The warm holding zone. Think of a cafeteria stew or a big pot of gravy. Cooking kills the vegetative cells, but the spores survive. If the food just sits there warm for hours, the spores germinate. You then ingest a huge load, about 100 million organisms.
And once they hit the gut,
They form an enterotoxin in vivo. It causes watery diarrhea and cramping, but usually no fever, no vomiting. It's miserable, but it passes in 24 hours.
before we leave perfringens, I want to visualize the lab diagnosis. Figure 14.5 shows a double zone of hemolysis.
This is a classic board exam visual. If you plate C. perfringens on blood agar, you see two distinct rings around the colony.
What's happening in each ring?
The inner ring is tight and clear. That's complete hemolysis from the theta toxin. The outer ring is wider and fuzzy, kind of cloudy. That's partial hemolysis from the alpha-toxin we discussed.
So double zone equals perfringens. Got it. Let's shift gears. We're moving from the tissue melter to the nerve blockers. Let's talk about Clostridium botulinum.
Botulism. Also found in the soil, also a strict anaerobe, but the mechanism of damage here is completely different. It's all focused on the neuromuscular junction.
Figure 14.6 seems to be the key here. We should probably walk through the normal physiology first. So normally, how does a nerve tell a muscle to move?
A nerve impulse travels down to the nerve terminal. Inside that terminal are these little vesicles. Think of them like cargo ships. And they're filled with a chemical called acetylcholine.
And acetylcholine is the go signal.
Right. To release that signal, the vesicle has to fuse with the nerve membrane. To do that, it needs to dock. And there are specific proteins called snare proteins on the vesicle and the membrane that act like a zipper or a docking clamp. They pull the vesicle close so it can open up.
Okay, so snare proteins are the docking clamps. Enter botulinum toxin.
The toxin is a protease. It's basically a pair of molecular scissors. And it specifically hunts down and cuts those snare proteins.
So the cargo ship is there. It's full of acetylcholine. The nerve impulse is screaming fire, but the docking clamps are broken.
Exactly. The vesicle cannot fuse. No acetylcholine is released. The muscle never gets the message to contract.
And the result is flaccid paralysis.
Everything goes limp. It usually starts with the cranial nerves, blurred vision, drooping eyelids, difficulty swallowing, and then it descends. If it hits the respiratory muscles, you stop breathing.
Now, there are 3 ways this happens, and the text distinguishes between intoxication and infection. Let's start with the classic, food-borne botulism.
This is the home canning scenario. Green beans, peppers, mushrooms. If the canning process isn't hot enough or pressurized enough, the spores can survive. And inside the sealed anaerobic jar, they germinate and produce the toxin into the food.
So when you eat the green beans, you're not waiting for bacteria to grow. You are eating a preformed neurotoxin.
Exactly. That is an intoxication. It hits fast.
Contrast that with infant botulism, the floppy baby syndrome.
This is actually the most common form in the U.S. now. Here, the infant ingests the spores, not the toxin.
Usually from raw honey, right? That's the one everyone knows.
Yes, honey is a big reservoir for these spores. Now, if you or I eat those spores, our gut microbiome is a jungle. We have billions of other bacteria that just outcompete the Clostridia. The spores pass right through.
But a baby's gut is different.
It's relatively sterile. There's no competition. So the spores can germinate, colonize the gut, and then produce the toxin in vivo.
Which explains the strict rule. No honey for kids under 1 year old.
Exactly. It's about giving their microbiome time to develop its defenses.
Treatment for botulism involves an antitoxin. But my understanding is that speed is absolutely critical.
It is. The antitoxin only neutralizes toxin that's floating in the blood. Once the toxin has entered the nerve and cut those snare proteins, the damage is done. The antitoxin can't fix a broken protein,
So you're just supporting the patient on a ventilator, waiting for the nerves to regenerate.
which can take weeks or even months.
Okay, let's flip the coin. Botulism prevents contraction. Now let's look at Clostridium tetani, which prevents relaxation.
Tetanus, spastic paralysis.
First off, the organism looks incredibly distinct under a microscope. Figure 14.8 shows it pretty clearly.
It's the tennis racket or drumstick appearance. It's a long, slender rod with a perfectly round terminal spore at the very tip. Once you see it, you never forget it.
So, pathogenesis. You step on the rusty nail. Spores get into a deep, low-oxygen wound. They produce tetanospasmin.
And this toxin is fascinating. It doesn't stay at the wound site. It enters the motor neurons and travels backward. It's called retrograde transport, all the way up the axon to the spinal cord.
It's climbing up the wiring into the main breaker box.
That's a good analogy, but it doesn't shut the power off like botulism. Tetanus toxin targets the inhibitory neurons.
The neurons that say stop.
Exactly. Normally, muscle movement is a balance. If your bicep contracts, your tricep gets a signal via glycine or GABA to relax. Tetanus toxin prevents the release of those inhibitory neurotransmitters.
So it cuts the brake lines.
Precisely. The motor neurons are just left in a state of unrestrained excitation. They fire constantly.
Leading to trismus lockjaw.
And rhizus sardonicus, that fixed, terrifying grin caused by facial muscle spasms. The contractions can be so violent they can actually fracture vertebrae.
It's just tragic because it's so preventable.
The DTaP vaccine. We use a deactivated version of the toxin to train the immune system. But unlike some vaccines, this immunity wanes. You need a booster every 10 years.
So if a patient comes in with a dirty wound and doesn't know their vaccine status, what do we do?
You don't take chances. You give them the booster, but you also give tetanus immune globulin, or TIG, that's preformed antibodies to neutralize any toxin immediately before it can bind to the nervous system.
All right, we've done the tissue destroyer, the flaccid paralyzer, and the spastic paralyzer. Now we have to talk about the opportunist in the gut, the hospital nightmare. Clostridium difficile, or C. diff.
This is a massive issue in modern healthcare. C. diff is unique here because for about 3% of the population, it's already in their gut. It's just part of the normal flora.
But it's not causing problems?
No, because it's outnumbered. The normal flora keeps it in check. The trouble starts when we interfere.
Antibiotics?
Specifically broad-spectrum ones like clindamycin, ampicillin, and cephalosporins. You take them to treat, say, pneumonia, but they basically carpet bomb your gut bacteria.
But C. diff is naturally resistant to a lot of those.
Right, so all its competition is wiped out. C. diff looks around, sees all this real estate and nutrients, and it just overgrows. And then it starts producing its toxins.
Toxin A and toxin B, how do we differentiate them?
A good way to remember it is A for attracts. Toxin A is an enterotoxin that causes fluid secretion and attracts inflammatory cells. That leads to diarrhea. And then B for boom. Toxin B is a cytotoxin. It disrupts the cytoskeleton of the colonic cells, causing them to collapse and die.
And the combination of that inflammation and cell death creates a very specific lesion.
Pseudomembranous colitis. If you were to do an endoscopy, you'd see these yellowish-white plaques covering the colon wall. That membrane is really just a crust of fibrin, mucus, and dead inflammatory cells.
Diagnosis is through a stool sample, looking for the toxins.
Yes, usually an ELISA test for toxin A and B.
And the treatment presents a bit of a paradox. Antibiotics cause this, but we need antibiotics to fix it.
It is a delicate situation. First, you stop the antibiotic that caused the problem. Then you treat the C. diff with something like metronidazole or oral vancomycin.
Why specify oral vancomycin? Usually we give vanco through an IV.
Great question. Vancomycin is a huge molecule. If you give it early, it is not absorbed into the bloodstream at all. It just stays in the gut, which is exactly what we want. We want the drug right there in the colon where the bacteria are at very high concentrations.
That makes perfect sense. Okay, that wraps up the Clostridia, the spore formers. But the chapter has one more section, the anaerobic gram-negative rods.
We're leaving spores behind now. These don't form spores. And the big name here is Bacteroides fragilis.
Lippincott drops a statistic here that always blows my mind. Bacteroides is the most common anaerobe in the human colon. It outnumbers E. coli 1,000 to 1.
It really puts things in perspective. We obsess over E. coli, but Bacteroides is the true king of the gut microbiome. And usually it's a friendly neighbor. It helps us process complex sugars.
Until it gets out.
Exactly. If the bowel wall ruptures from appendicitis, diverticulitis, a gunshot wound, or even surgery, Bacteroides spills into the sterile peritoneal cavity.
And that's when you get abscesses.
Right. Bacteroides has this polysaccharide capsule that protects it from our immune cells. It's very slippery. But the key concept for the learner here is synergy.
The buddy system.
These intra-abdominal infections are almost never just one bug. They're polymicrobial. You usually find a facultative anaerobe, like E. coli, right alongside the strict anaerobe, Bacteroides.
And they help each other survive.
In a very clever way.
Yeah.
E. coli can use oxygen. So initially, E. coli starts growing and consumes all the available oxygen in the wound site.
It scrubs the air for its friend.
It lowers the oxygen tension. This creates the perfect anaerobic environment for Bacteroides to wake up, take over, and form the abscess.
So E. coli prepares the room and Bacteroides moves in.
That's the synergy. And treating these is tough. Abscesses have thick walls that antibiotics don't penetrate well.
Which brings us to that old surgical maxim, never let the sun set on undrained pus.
Crude, but accurate. You have to drain the abscess. And chemically, Bacteroides produces beta-lactamase, so it's resistant to penicillin. You need to use something like metronidazole or carbapenems to kill it.
We have covered a massive amount of ground today. From the soil to the synapse to the colon. Let's try and distill this down. If our listener is walking into an exam or a clinic tomorrow, what are the absolute must-knows?
Okay, rapid-fire recap. First, see perfringens. Think gas gangrene, alpha-toxin, which is a lecithinase, and visually, the double zone of hemolysis.
Second, see botulinum. Think flaccid paralysis. It blocks acetylcholine release by cutting snare proteins. And remember the two forms. Adults eat the toxin from canning, babies eat the spores from honey.
Third, see tetani. Think spastic paralysis. It travels retrograde to the spinal cord and blocks the inhibitory transmitters GABA and glycine, and look for the tennis racket spores.
Fourth, C. difficile, the antibiotic-associated diarrhea. Toxin A and B cause pseudomembranes, and you treat it with oral vancomycin.
And finally, Bacteroides, the non-spore former. It causes abdominal abscesses through synergy with oxygen-scavenging bacteria like E. coli.
It really highlights the fragility of our own biological systems. Blocking one tiny neurotransmitter or disrupting a cell membrane is just catastrophic.
And it brings us right back to that first point, oxygen. These organisms are ancient survivors from a time before the Earth even had an oxygen atmosphere. They're still here, hiding in the dark, waiting for that moment when circulation fails and the oxygen drops.
A grim but necessary reminder that healthy tissue oxygenation is one of our best defenses against infection.
Absolutely. Keep the blood flowing, keep the wounds clean.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the anaerobic world. We hope this makes Chapter 14 a little less intimidating and a lot more memorable.
Keep questioning, keep learning.
This has been the Last Minute Lecture Team. See you in the next deep dive.